The order was read out in the chancel of St. Cuthbert's at 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, and Thomasin Stannard stood directly underneath the thing her father had gone to gaol for, and listened to a stranger explain what it would cost her to put it back. There were 6 people in the chancel, and no fire anywhere in the building. The apparitor, a mild, damp man named Baisley, who had come out from Harnworth on the carrier's cart, read from a paper held in both hands because his fingers were cold, and read badly, the way men read who have read the same sentences 400 times, whereas the said monument in the north wall of the chancel of the parish church of Ninebarrow was upon the 3rd day of November, in the year 1817, wilfully and maliciously defaced and injured by one Simeon Stannard, letter cutter, of this parish, since deceased, and whereas the said injury remains unrepaired to the scandal of the said church. Thomasin kept her eyes on the floor. There was a brass in the paving by her left boot, a knight with his feet on a hound, worn down to a grey shine by 200 years of people standing where she was standing, and she looked at that. And whereas by the order of the justices at the Epiphany sessions in the year 1818, the said damage was directed to be made good at the charge of the offender, and he being deceased and intestate, at the charge of his estate and of such person as hath taken upon herself the administration thereof. That is you, said Mr. Kite kindly, from the other side of the chancel. I know who it is, said Thomasin. Baisley read on. The words were long, and there were a great many of them, and the substance of them was very short. She was required to make good the monument to the satisfaction of the archdeacon or his surrogate, at her own proper charge, and to enter into a recognizance in the sum of £200 that the work would be done, and done properly, by the day of the adjourned visitation, which was fixed for the 18th day of December, failing which she would stand committed for contempt until she found the money, or the court got tired of her, whichever came first. £200. Her father had died owing £11 and 4 shillings for his keep in Harnworth gaol. You may look at it, Miss Stannard, said the rector. Nobody will stop you looking at it. So she turned round and looked at it, which she had been putting off for 9 minutes. The Alderminster monument filled the north wall of the chancel from the string course to within a foot of the roof. Black marble columns, a broken pediment, an urn, 2 mourning figures in white stone with their faces turned away from each other, and in the middle of it all, a great plain panel of Netherley freestone, 4 feet by 3, with the inscription cut into it in Roman capitals 1 1/4 inch high. Her father had cut every one of those letters in the summer and autumn of 1811, on a banker set up in the south aisle, with the boards down and the birds getting in, and she had knelt on the flags beside him and rubbed the chalk into the setting out lines and been told to keep her elbows off the stone. 3 lines of it were gone, not chipped, not smashed. Somebody, looking quickly, would have said smashed, and everybody had. The 3 lines in the middle of the panel, where the dates were, had been picked out with a fine chisel to a depth of about 1/8 inch across their whole length, so that there were now 3 long, shallow trenches across the face of the stone, with ragged bottoms and clean square ends, and in the trenches there was a mess of white dust and old wax, and 1 small dark stain that might have been anything, and was in fact lamp oil. It had been done at night, by one man, working upward from the left in the dark, with a lantern set on the altar rail. He had got through 3 lines and started the 4th. Then he had stopped, because Job Redaway had come in with the churchwarden behind him and taken hold of his arm. "It is worse than I remembered," said Thomasin. "It is a scandal," said Mr. Kite. "It has been a scandal for 3 years, and I have said so at every vestry." Mr. Nathaniel Kite was 58 and had the neatest hands of any man in the county. He was not a large man, or a loud one. He had given Ninebarrow its school and its bridge and half its ring of bells, and he had given them without a plaque, which everybody knew about. He stood now with his hat off in the presence of the monument, and his gloves in his hat, and he looked at Thomasin with what looked exactly like sorrow. "I want to say one thing before Mr. Baisley goes," he said, "and I want it heard. Miss Stannard, I bear you no ill will whatever. Your father was a good workman, and he was not in his right mind at the end, and what he did here he did in an affliction. I have offered, and I offer again in front of these gentlemen, to have a new tablet cut at my own charge by Prideaux of Harnworth, in the best statuary marble, and set in this frame before Christmas, and the whole of this ugly business forgotten. I have offered it twice. She has refused it twice. 3 times, said Thomasin. Then let it be 3. He turned his hat in his hands. Sir, I ask you to note that the parish has done everything it can to spare this woman. She will not be spared. She insists on the letter of the order. I insist on repairing my father's work, said Thomasin, because it is my father's work, and because the order says made good, and made good does not mean thrown away and a new one bought. If you take that panel out of that wall, you will break it. It is 1 3/8 inches thick in the middle, and it is 4 feet across, and it has been in a damp wall for 9 years. It will come out in 5 pieces, and you will burn what is left for lime. There was a small silence in the chancel. The rector, Mr. Dallimore, looked at the floor. He was a decent man, and he had been frightened for so long that fright had become his ordinary expression. How do you know what it is thick? Said Kite. She had not meant to say it. She had told herself on the road from Harnworth, twice a mile for 11 miles, that she would say nothing at all in this building today except yes and no. Because I have measured it, said Thomasin. When? Yesterday evening. The door was open. With what? With a straight edge and a wire down the back of the frame, and I put it all back as I found it. Kite looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he smiled, and the smile was not unkind, which was the worst part of Mr. Kite, and always had been. You see, he said gently, to Baisley, to the rector, to the cold air, the father used to measure things too. The recognizance wanted sureties. That was the part nobody had told her about on the road. She could bind herself in £200 all she liked. The court did not care what she promised, because she had nothing, and a promise from a person with nothing is only noise. What the court wanted was 2 solid men to bind themselves in £100 apiece, or one in the whole 200, that Thomasin Stannard would finish the work and would not go off in the night. You have until the 12th, said Baisley, packing his papers away, not unsympathetically. Bring me 2 names, and I will write them in, and there is an end of it. If you cannot, I am to inform the surrogate, and then I am afraid it is out of everybody's hands. She spent the 8th and the 9th of October walking. She asked Mr. Prideaux, who had employed her for 4 years in Harnworth, and who had taught her nothing at all, because her father had already taught her everything. And Prideaux said that he was very sorry, and that he had a wife, and that he did business with Mr. Kite. She asked the innkeeper at Ninebarrow, who had known her since she was small, and who could not meet her eye, and gave her a pint of beer instead. She asked the miller at Combe Bottom, who said he would think about it, and thought about it for a day, and sent a note. She did not ask the rector, because the rector had been in the chancel and had said nothing at all in the whole of half an hour, and she had done with asking things of men who could not talk. By the evening of the 9th she was sitting on a milestone on the Harnworth road with her father's chisel roll on her knees, doing arithmetic that would not come out. She could cut 3 indents of new stone into that panel and letter them properly for about £9, if she had the stone free and slept in the church. £9 was possible. £200 of surety was not, and never would be, and the whole thing was going to end with her in Harnworth gaol, in the same yard her father had died in, for the crime of refusing a free marble tablet from the kindest man in the parish. She sat there until the light went off the top of the beeches. Then she got up and turned north, which was the direction nobody in Ninebarrow walked in. The Alderminster drive is 1.75 miles long, and it was blocked at the second bend by a fallen ash that had been lying there long enough to grow moss on the upper side. She went round it through the wet grass. There was a lodge with no light in it. There were sheep in the park, and they were somebody's, and they had been let in. The house was enormous and almost entirely shut. 19 windows across the front, and 2 of them with light behind, both at the east end. Downstairs, everything else was blind, shutters closed on the inside, and on the upper floors that particular flat dark that a room gets when the furniture has been under sheets for 10 years. They said in Ninebarrow that the sickness was still in the house. They said it the way people say a thing they have stopped examining, at the end of a sentence about something else. Old Duke died of it. Young Duke took it and lived. And it is in the wool, and the hangings and the mortar, and it will come out of that house one day like damp. Nobody delivered above the lodge. The doctor from Harnworth would go as far as the terrace steps. 2 whole generations of Ninebarrow had grown up with a rule about a hill. Thomasin had had the smallpox by inoculation in the spring of 1808, at the age of 14, from a man who came round the parishes in a gig, and did it for 1 and 6pence, with a lancet and a piece of thread, and she had been very ill for 4 days, and had 1 round white mark on her left upper arm ever since. Her father had held her arm still. He had said that a thing you have had cannot be had again, and that people who are frightened are not stupid, they are only frightened, and that the 2 look the same from outside and are not the same at all. She pulled the bell at the east end and heard it a long way off. The woman who opened the door was about 60, grey, upright, in a black stuff gown, and she looked at Thomasin with the frank astonishment of somebody watching a horse come up the steps. "I want to speak to the Duke of Alderminster," said Thomasin. "On what business?" "Stone," Mrs. Vosper considered this. "You are the Stannard girl." "I am Simeon Stannard's daughter." "Yes, then, you had better come out of the wet," said Mrs. Vosper. "And I will ask him, and he will say no." He said no for 4 minutes, and then he stopped saying it. The room she was shown into had been a breakfast room, and was now everything: a table with estate papers in stacks weighted with stones, a fire, 2 chairs, a bed made up on a sofa against the far wall, as though somebody had stopped bothering to go upstairs some years ago. There was 1 candle lit, and 1 lamp, both on the left of the table. The Duke of Alderminster stood up when she came in, which she had not expected, and turned his right side towards her, which she had. He was about 35. He was tall and thin in the way of a man who eats because it is on the table. The right side of his face was a perfectly ordinary face, dark, tired, with a good jaw. The left side, from the temple down over the cheekbone to the jaw and on down the neck into his collar, was pitted deeply and closely all over with old healed marks, hundreds of them, run together in places into hollows the size of a thumbnail, and long healed and pale. The left eye was open and pale blue-white, and saw nothing. He had turned so that all of that was away from the lamp and away from her. "Miss Stannard," he said. His voice was low and perfectly clear, and he used it as though it cost money. "Your Grace, you want stone, Netherley stone, 3 pieces, and none of them bigger than my 2 hands, but they must be Netherley, and they must be off the white bed, because that is what the panel is, and anything else will show like a patch on a coat." She stopped. She had been told all her life that she came at people too fast. "I am to repair your father's monument. Mr. Kite has the Netherley quarries and will not sell me a barrow load." "No," he agreed. He would not. "They tell me there is an old working in your wood at Hanger Copse that was got out of before Netherley was opened, and that the monument stone in the church came out of it, and that it is still yours." There was a pause of some length. The fire moved. "Who tells you that?" "A man called Micah Lugg. He is one of Mr. Kite's own quarrymen, and he told me at the door of the Bell in front of 4 people, and he will be paid out for it. So I would take it kindly if it were not repeated." The Duke turned his head very slightly, which was the only way he could look at anything properly, and looked at her with his good eye for rather a long time. "You have not once," he said, "since you came into this room, arranged your face." "No," said Thomasin. "I am looking at stone all day. I have got out of the habit." On the 12th of October, Bazley sent word from Harnworth that the recognizance was entered and that Miss Stannard might proceed. She read the note 4 times standing in the church porch. It said that the sum of £200 was secured, that the sureties had been taken and allowed, and that the counterpart lay at the registry and could be inspected there upon payment of the usual fee, which was 2 shillings and 6pence, which she did not have and would not have until she was paid for work she had not started. She asked at the Bell that evening who in the parish had stood for her, and got nothing, because nobody knew, because nobody had. So she began. "A letter cutter works at a banker, which is a low, heavy bench, and hers was 3 planks on 2 flour barrels in the south aisle of St. Cuthbert's, on the exact spot where her father's had stood in 1811, because it is the only place in that church where the light comes in over your left shoulder all morning." She had her father's roll of chisels, which had been sold with his other things, and bought back over 2 years, 1 and 2 at a time, out of Harnworth pawn shops, and were therefore the most expensive tools in England. She had a mallet of lignum vitae with his thumb shine on the handle. She had a 100-weight of sacking, a straight edge, a wire, a spirit level, a plumb bob, a bag of dry sand, a lump of red heel ball, and a roll of thin paper. And she had Kester Byam, who was 17, who came with the churchwarden's grudging leave at 4pence a day, because there was no other work in Ninebarrow in October, and who on the first morning asked her what the letters said. "Can you not read?" "I can read print," said Kester. "That is not print. That is all straight up and down, and there are no gaps. There are gaps. There are word spaces of half a letter, and you will learn to see them in a week. Hold that end." The first 3 days she did not cut anything at all. Kester found this hard. She washed the panel down with clean water and a soft brush, twice, and let it dry, and looked at it. She set the straight edge across the face in 11 places and marked with a soft pencil where it rocked. She ran the wire down behind the frame at both ends and in the middle, and wrote the figures in the back of her father's memorandum book, which was the only book she owned. She lit a candle and held it at the level of the stone, and walked it slowly along, 12 inches out, and watched what the shadows did in the letters. She stood on the altar step and looked at the panel from 8 feet away with her head on one side for so long that Kester went outside. On the evening of the 3rd day she wrote out what she had. The panel was Netherly white bed, laid on its natural bed, which was correct. 4 feet 1 inch by 3 feet 2. At the left-hand end it was 2 inches and a quarter thick, which is what such a panel ought to be. In the middle it was 1 inch and 3/8. The face was not flat. From the top of the 9th line to the bottom of the 12th, across a band 11 inches deep and the whole width of the stone, the face lay some 7/8 of an inch behind the plane of the rest, and the transition at the top and bottom of that band was not a break or a chip, but a long, patient, feathered slope, worked out with a claw chisel and rubbed off with a bed of sand until it was very nearly invisible. Very nearly. It was a beautiful piece of work. It had been done by a good man, being paid well. Somebody had cut 11 inches of that inscription away, and cut it again. She sat on the chancel step with her hands inside her sleeves and let herself understand it slowly, the way you let a bruise come up. Her father had cut the panel in 1811. She had been there. She had rubbed the chalk into his scribed lines and been shouted at for putting her elbow on the stone, and she had gone home with white dust in the parting of her hair every day for 5 weeks. He had cut it standing, in the aisle, from a copy in the old rector's hand, and when it was done he had gone up on the scaffold with the mason and watched it bedded into the frame, and then he had gone away for 4 days and drunk a great deal, which was what he always did after a good job and never at any other time. And, at some point since, when the church was shut and boarded and full of ladders, another man had come in and taken a claw chisel to it. The next morning she took Kester into the chancel and made him stand on the altar step and look up. "Read me the lines from the top," she said. "Not the words. Count them." He counted 14. "Now look at the 12th. The one that says in the 62nd year of his age. Look at the E. It is an E. Look at the top arm and the bottom arm. Now look at any other E on that stone. There are 41 of them, and I will wait." He looked for a long time, and she watched him find it, which is a thing she had always liked and had not had in a long while. "The others have got little feet on the ends," said Kester. "Straight little feet. That one has got feet that go up. Serifs, yes, and the bottom arm of every E my father ever cut is longer than the top arm, by about a 16th, because his masters were, and his master was a Bristol man. That E has arms of a length. And the O in of is a true circle, and my father never cut a true circle in his life. He cut them a hair wide, because a true circle reads narrow at a distance, and the whole of that line is set out to a measure 1.5 inches short of the measure of every other line on the stone, so it sits in the middle with too much air round it like a man in a coat that is not his. Kester said nothing at all. He was 17, and he had been carrying sand for 4 days. "That line was not cut by my father," said Thomasin. "It was cut by somebody else, later, and the 3 lines above it, the ones he took out, were cut by that same somebody, and I want you to say none of this in the bell tonight, and I know you will. So I want you to say it to Micah Lugg first, and nobody else." Micah Lugg was turned off at Netherley on the Saturday, with his 11 years, for talking at the door of a public house. Mr. Kite did it himself, and was very sorry about it and gave him a sovereign, and Lugg walked the 4 miles to Ninebarrow and knocked on the vestry door at 7 in the morning on the Monday, and said that as he had nothing else to do, he might as well come and show her where the old hole was. The old hole was in Hanger Copse, 300 yards inside the estate wall, and it had not been worked since 1806. What it looked like was a hillside with hazel growing out of it. What it was when Lugg had spent an hour with a billhook, and Kester had spent 2 with a mattock, was a face of good white stone 9 feet high, with a bramble bank on top of it, and the old plug marks still in it. A row of half-round grooves going up the face like the fossil of a comb. The Duke of Alderminster came down at 8 and stayed until 4, and did that on the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th of October, and nobody remarked on it, because there was nobody there to remark except 3 people who were busy. He was not much use in the first hour, and he knew it, and instead of pretending otherwise, he asked, which Thomasin had not expected. He asked what the bed was, and why it mattered which way up a stone lay, and she told him that stone comes out of the ground in layers like the leaves of a book, and if you set it in a wall the way it grew, the rain runs off the edges of the leaves and the stone lasts 400 years, and if you set it on edge, the rain gets in between the leaves, and in 80 years it sheds its face in flakes, like a man peeling after a fever. He said that he had lived in a house made of it for 35 years, and had never once been told that. "Nobody tells anybody anything," said Thomasin. "That is most of my trade." He worked with his head turned. She noticed it on the first morning, and understood it by the afternoon. He had no sight at all on the left, so to see a thing on his left he had to bring his whole head round, and a man doing that all day with a crowbar looks either clumsy or arrogant, and he had spent 10 years being thought both. Once she moved a wedge 2 feet to the right without saying anything, so that it came into the half of the world he could see, and he stopped and looked at her, and then picked it up and went on and said nothing, and after that she did it every time, and he never once mentioned it. You do not cut a block out of a quarry. You persuade it. Lugg drilled the line of holes with a jumper and a lump hammer, 6 inches apart, straight down the natural joint, and Kester fed him water, and Thomasin set the plugs and feathers in, 2 curved iron shims in each hole and an iron wedge between them, and then went down the line tapping each wedge once, a quarter turn of a tap, over and over, 20 times down the line, 40, listening. "You are not hitting them hard," said the Duke. "If I hit them hard, I get 4 pieces. You go along, and you let the stone decide where it is going to come, and it will tell you before it does it. Listen to this one." She tapped a wedge near the middle. It gave back a dull, short sound. "That is tight." She tapped the next. "That is looser. That is the stone opening under there where we cannot see." There will be a crack come up between these two in about 10 minutes, and it will run right along and take the whole block off in one piece, and you will hear it. It sounds like a door in another part of the house. It took 19 minutes, and it sounded exactly like that. The block came off 2 feet 8 by 2 feet by 14 inches, more than 4 times what she needed, because you cannot get a small block out of a fresh face, and because she wanted spare in case she spoiled a piece, and it went on a sledge behind the estate's one remaining cart horse, and up to the mason's shed at the court. And when it was on the blocks, she wetted the sawn face, and looked at it and put her thumbnail into it. Her thumbnail went in. "Feel that," she said to the Duke. He put his thumb where hers had been and pressed, and looked up, honestly startled, because his nail had gone into the stone as though it were hard cheese. "That is what green stone is," said Thomasin. "It comes out of the ground full of quarry sap, which is water with the ghost of the stone dissolved in it, and while the sap is in it you can cut it with anything. You can nearly cut it with your thumb. And you can work a letter in it in a third of the time and get an edge on the cut like a folded page. And every day from today the sap comes out of it, and the ghost stays behind, and sets, and it gets harder, and it goes on getting harder for years, and after about 8 weeks it stops being stone you can persuade, and starts being stone you have to fight." 8 weeks, said the Duke. 6 if the wind is east. Then it works like oak. And by the spring it works like flint, and it will burn the temper off a chisel in 10 minutes. And I will be cutting an inch of letter an hour instead of 6. And it will not be as good, because you cannot cut a crisp arris in a dry stone, you can only cut a tired one. She took the point of a chisel and scratched the day into the top of the block, where it would be waste, the 10th of October, 1820. "Why write it on?" said Kester. "Because in a month I will want to lie to myself about how old it is." The Duke of Alderminster stood looking at the scratched date on the whetstone with his hand still flat on it, and Thomasin, packing her tools, understood 2 things at once and did not say either. The first was that his hand had been on that block for a full minute in a cold wind, and he had not moved it, because it was the first thing he had made with his hands in 10 years, and he did not want to stop touching it. The second was that the 18th of December was 10 weeks away, and her stone would be dead hard for the last 2 of them, and no power on earth was going to change either date. That night she filled a saucer with water and set it on the sill of the mason's shed window before she went down to her lodging, which was a hayloft over the stable, with a lamp she was not allowed to leave burning. In the morning there was nothing on it. She wrote nothing on it in the memorandum book, under the 14th of October, and thought that a woman with £200 of other people's money over her head ought perhaps to have found something better to be frightened of than a saucer. The way she came to be eating at that house was that Mrs. Vosper simply stopped asking. On the 17th of October, there was a plate at the end of the table at 6:30 with a cloth over it. On the 18th there was a plate and a chair pulled out. By the 22nd there was a place laid, properly, with the Alderminster crest worn nearly off the spoon, and Mrs. Vosper standing behind it with her hands folded, waiting, in the manner of a woman who has been running a house with nobody in it for 10 years, and has found something to do. Thomasin ate there most evenings from then on, in her working clothes, with stone dust in the creases of her knuckles that no amount of washing at the pump would shift. And it was the only hot meal in her day, and she was too tired and too poor to be proud about it. They did not talk much at first. He read while he ate, which she had been brought up to think was bad manners, and had always privately thought was the only civilized way to have a meal. She discovered by the third evening that the bread and the salt and the water jug always ended up on the right-hand side of his plate, and that this was not chance. Mrs. Vosper put them there. Anything on his left he found by knocking it over. So Thomasin began doing it too, without saying anything about it, and one evening Mrs. Vosper caught her sliding the salt 6 inches to the right with one finger, and looked at her for a moment, and then went out of the room and shut the door rather firmly. Things began to appear. The boards came off the south window of the chancel, which had been shuttered since the repairs of 1815, and the light that came through it was thin and grey, and had not been in that building for 5 years. A brazier appeared, and a sack of charcoal beside it, and then a second sack. A leather apron, old, good, far too big for her, with the previous owner's shape worn into it. And on the last day of October, on the corner of her banker, a folio out of the Alderminster library with a strip of paper in it, an engraved book of Roman alphabets, the letters set out full size on a grid, printed at Rome, with the plates protected by tissue, and every tissue still in place. She did not thank him for any of it, because he had left none of it where thanks could be given, and by then she had worked out that this was deliberate. She learned him in the way you learn a difficult stone, by working next to him and paying attention. He did the estate's accounts himself at that table every evening, because there was no agent, and there was no agent because there was no money to pay one, and there was no money because £40,000 sat on the estate like a stone on a chest, and had done since 1810. He walked out at first light, and came back wet. He had not been to church in 10 years. He would not go into any room where more than 4 people were, and he had a way, when he had to speak to a stranger, of turning very slightly, so that his right side led, that was so practiced it had stopped being a movement and become a habit of standing. And he could not be thanked, and could not be looked at. And those were the same thing. On the 2nd of November, she walked the 11 miles into Harnworth, paid 2 shillings and 6pence out of the first money she had earned in a month, and asked the registry clerk for the counterpart of the recognizance in the matter of the monument at Ninebarrow. She read it standing at the counter. Roland Quennell, Duke of Alderminster. Of Alderminster, in the said count, bound in the sum of £200, 1 surety, not 2. The whole of it, in one name, entered on the 11th day of October, which was the day after they had got the block out at Hanger Copse, and the day before Baisley's note had come telling her she might proceed. She walked the 11 miles back in the dark, and did not remember any of it. He was at the table with the accounts when she came in without knocking, which she had never done, and she stood in the doorway with her bonnet in her hand and the rain coming off her. £200, said Thomasin. The Duke of Alderminster put down his pen. You have not got £200, she said. There is a tree across your drive that has been there since the winter before last, because you cannot pay a man to cut it up. There are somebody else's sheep in your park, and I do not think you know whose. Mrs. Vosper turns the sheets side to middle. You have got a mortgage on this place that eats every farthing that comes into it, and you went into Harnworth on the 11th of October, and bound yourself in £200, that a woman you had met once would finish a piece of work she has never been paid for. Yes, he said. If I fail, they will have it off you. They will try. Why? He was silent long enough that she thought he was not going to answer at all, and then he pushed the candle a little away from himself, which she had never seen him do, so that it lit the whole of his face and not the half of it. Because nobody stood for your father, he said. Thomasin found that she had to look at the floor, which she had not had to do in that room before. He wanted a surety, said the Duke. In 1817, before it came on for trial, he could have been bailed for £40, and he asked 6 men in this parish, and every one of them said no, and one of them was my churchwarden and another was my rector, and he lay in Harnworth for 11 weeks waiting for the sessions, and by the time he came into that court, he looked like what they said he was. I was in this room the whole time. I knew about it on the Tuesday. I did nothing at all, because I do not go among people, and because I was told he was mad, and it was very convenient to be told a thing that meant I need not go among people. You did not know him. No, he agreed. That is not a defense. That is only a fact. She stood there in the wet, and could not think of one word to say. And there is a second reason, said the Duke of Alderminster, and you will have it too, because you will find it out anyway. You find everything out. There is a book in the muniment room of this house with my name signed in it 3 times in the March of 1810. I have looked at that signature for 10 years. It is my hand. I cannot tell you that it is not my hand. He picked up his pen again, and looked at it, and set it down. I wanted once in my life to put my name to something, and know afterwards what I had signed. In the first week of November she began to cut, and the first thing she cut was not stone. To let a new piece into an old one you must first make the hole honest. A ragged trench with a torn bottom will take nothing. You square it up, you sink it to one true depth, you undercut nothing, and you leave the ends dead square, so the joint is a line and not a smear. That was 3 days of small, careful work standing on a plank between 2 trestles with her face 9 inches from the wall, and on the first afternoon of it her chisel came up under something that was not stone, and lifted it out whole. It was a plug the size and shape of a grain of barley, hard, waxy, a shade whiter than the panel around it, and when she rolled it between finger and thumb it did not powder. It smeared. She got down off the plank and took it to the south window and turned it in the light for about 4 minutes. It was a stopping, a filler of the kind every monumental mason in England keeps in a pot and denies keeping. Beeswax and resin melted together and charged with the dust of the same stone you are filling, so that it takes the color and takes a polish, and if you are any good, becomes invisible to everybody who has not spent their life looking. Perfectly respectable in its place. You stop a vent. You stop a shake. You stop the little wormholes that run through a bed of freestone like a sneeze. What you do not do is stop letters. The dust in this one was not white. Held to the light and turned, it had a cold, grey-blue cast to it, like skimmed milk. She went back up on the plank and worked along the trench with a needle and a rag and warm water, and a pennyworth of spirits of turpentine, and by dark she had a handful of the stuff in a fold of paper, and under where it had been there was something she sat down on the chancel step and looked at for a long time. The bottom of the trench was not flat. It was not even rough in the way that hacked stone is rough. Running along it, so shallow that you could only find them by dragging a fingernail sideways across the stone, were little smooth V-shaped hollows, a 16th of an inch deep, some of them a full inch long, some of them no longer than a grain of rice, and they were not scratches, and they were not tool marks, and they were not random. They were the bottoms of cut letters. Deeper letters, from an older cutting, that had gone down further into the stone than the man in 1815 had cut the surface away, so that when he had ground the face back 7/8 of an inch he had not quite got rid of them, and had filled what was left with wax, and had gone home. Her father had been picking that wax out with a chisel by lantern light at midnight in November 1817, and Job Reddaway had walked in and seen a man defacing a duke's monument in the dark. She was 20 minutes late for dinner and did not eat anything. "You have found something," said the duke. "I have found what my father was doing." She turned her hands over and looked at them. "I have not found anything I could show a court. A magistrate wants a thing he can see from where he is standing. I have got hollows the depth of a hair, in a dark church 12 feet up, and a lump of wax." "Show me the wax." She put the paper on the table between the candle and his plate, and he turned it into the light with one finger, and looked, and then went on looking, in a way she was beginning to recognize. He did not look at things briefly. It was the one advantage he had got out of 10 years of not going among people. "That is Netherley stone in it," he said. "It is not the white bed. No, there is a blue bed under the white at Netherley. My father would not let it be opened. He said it went off in a frost, and he was not going to have his name on a quarry that sold stone that shed its face." Thomasin put her hand flat on the table. "When was it opened?" "After I do not know the year. Lug will know." She went out to the shed after supper and worked on the block by lantern for 3 hours, which she did not need to do, because her hands wanted something. 2 days later she did the thing that got her talked about in 3 parishes. She wanted to know how far the recut band ran, exactly to the inch, because the edges of it were feathered so cleverly that she could feel them and not see them, and there is an old trick for that which every mason knows and which looks, to anybody who does not, like a species of madness. She waited for a dry, cold afternoon. She got Kester to fill 2 buckets at the well. And in front of Kester Byam, the Reverend Mr. Dallimore, who had come in for the register, and Job Reddaway, who was mending a hassock, she threw 8 quarts of clean cold water straight at the Alderminster monument. Mr. Dallimore made a sound she remembered for years. The water sheeted down the panel and off the string course, and made a dark half-moon on the flags, and the stone went from white to grey all over, and for about 40 seconds it was simply a wet wall. Then it began to dry. It dried from the edges in, the way stone does, and it did not dry evenly, because the stone in the middle of that panel had a different skin from the stone around it. New worked stone, ground back and rubbed with sand, has had its weathered face taken off, and it lets water go quicker than stone that has stood in the air for 200 years, and the filled letters, being wax, would not take the water at all. So out of the wet grey wall there came up, first as a shape and then as an edge you could have ruled a line along, a pale rectangle 11 inches deep and 3 feet 10 wide, and inside the pale rectangle. Scattered through the words that were carved there in plain sight, a fine, irregular ghosting of small pale marks that did not belong to any letter on that stone. It lasted about a minute and a half. Then the whole panel went the same color, and it was one wall again. Nobody said anything at all. "That," said Thomasin, into the silence, to the rector, "is where somebody cut this inscription out and cut it again, and I would be obliged if you would write down in your own hand that you saw it, and the day and the hour, and sign it, sir, because you will be asked." Mr. Dallimore looked up at the monument with his mouth slightly open and his register under his arm. "Miss Stannard," he said, in a voice that had a great deal of exhaustion in it, "I cannot write that down. You saw it. I saw a wet wall. A rubbing was no good. She tried it twice and threw both away. Heel ball on thin paper will pick up a cut a 30-second deep and give you back a black page with the letter standing white in it, and it is the best evidence in the world, and it wants an edge to catch on." The ghosts had no edges. They were rounded off at the top by 200 years of nothing, and by a man with a bed of sand, and the paper went over them as if they were not there. What they had was depth, and the only thing on this earth that shows depth is light coming across it. Everybody has seen it. It is why you can read a worn gravestone at 8 in the evening in June and not at noon. It is why the ruts in a road disappear at midday and stand up like ploughing at sunset. Light straight on a stone fills every hollow and tells you nothing. Light along a stone, coming in at a hand's breadth off the face, throws a shadow out of a hollow a hair deep and makes it a black stripe you can see across a church. Her father called it raking light, and said that a cut letter is not a shape but a shadow, and that a man who forgets that is a sign writer with a chisel. St. Cuthbert's chancel has one window in the south wall, and the Alderminster monument is on the north wall opposite it, and between the first week of November and the middle of January, and at no other time in the year. The sun gets low enough in the afternoon to come through that window and lie almost flat along the north wall for about 20 minutes, from a little after 2:10 until about 1/2. That was the first thing her father taught her about lettering, and the last thing anybody ever believed about him. "Cut for the light you will have," he used to say, standing back in the aisle with his thumbs in his apron. "Any fool can cut a letter you can read with your nose against it." She waited 8 days for a clear afternoon and got grey rain, fog until 11 and then grey, so on the 11th of November, at 9 in the evening she went into the church with a plank, 2 trestles, a lantern, and the Duke of Alderminster, and did what her father had done, and understood, on the 4th rung of the ladder, exactly why he had done it. "You cannot move the sun. You can move a lamp. Stand there," she said. "No, there. Now hold it out at arm's length from the wall, at the height of my chin, and bring it in until I say." He came in slowly with the lantern held out sideways at the full stretch of his arm, and the light crawled across the face of the panel, and where it went the wall came alive, every worn place, every chip, every one of the little hollows stood up out of the stone with a black shadow beside it 1/4 of an inch long. "There," said Thomasin. "Stop there. Do not move your hand." And she put her nose 4 inches from the stone and began to read the bottoms of letters that had been ground off and waxed over 5 years before she was told to repair them. It is a slow business. A V-cut letter is two sloping faces meeting in a line at the bottom. And if you grind the face of the stone away, you take the letter with it until only the last of that meeting line is left. So what survives is not a letter but a skeleton, a thread where the middle of each stroke used to be, broken where the cut was shallow, strong where it was deep. A serif goes first, a curve goes to a comma, but the spine of an I stays, and the spine of an L turns a corner, and once you have the spines and the spacing you can put the flesh back on, because letters are not shapes, they are habits, and she had her father's habits in her hands. They worked from 9 until 1:30 that night, and from 8 until 2 the next, and on the third night the Duke said, holding the lantern at arm's length for the 40th minute without a sound of complaint, "You should not be in this house. I am not in your house. I am in your church." I meant at my table. He shifted the lantern a fraction and steadied it. You will not have noticed that Kester Byam does not come up the hill. His mother will not let him pass the lodge. They are not unkind people. They believe it is still here. I know what they believe. Then you should be careful, because they will hold it against you, and you have to live in this parish after. Thomasin came down off the plank, put her chisel in her apron, undid the button at her left cuff, and pushed the sleeve up past her elbow, and held her bare arm out into the lantern light. Halfway up the outside of it there was a round white scar about the size of a 4-penny piece, a little sunk, a little puckered at the rim. 8th of April, 1808, she said. A man in a gig, 1 and 6pence, in the yard behind the bell, 11 of us in a row along the wall. My father held my arm. I was ill 4 days, and I have not been ill since, and I never shall be, because a thing you have had cannot be had again. She pulled the sleeve down and buttoned it. I am the safest person in this parish. So are you. There are 2 people in the whole of Ninebarrow that thing can never touch, and they are standing in this chancel holding a lantern. The Duke of Alderminster did not say anything for a moment. Then he lifted the light back to the height of her chin without being asked. Go on, he said. They got the second line that night, working backward from the right-hand end, and at 1:10 in the morning she stopped with her hand flat on the wall and did not speak for so long that he said her name. There is a word here, said Thomasin, that is 8 letters long, and the third one is a B, and the last 2 go down and then across, which is a Y, and there is not one word in this month or in any month in that year on that stone that is 8 letters long. February, said the Duke of Alderminster. It took 2 more nights to have the whole of it, and she would not say a word of it aloud until she had. The 3 lines that stood on the face of that panel in plain Roman capitals, cut by a man from a distance in the year 1815, said this: Who departed this life at Alderminster, on the 9th day of March, in the year of our Lord 1810. The 3 lines underneath them, a 16th of an inch down in the stone, cut by Simeon Stannard in the autumn of 1811 from a copy in the old rector's hand, said this: Who departed this life at Alderminster, on the 20th day of February, in the year of our Lord 1810. 17 days. She wrote both versions out twice, in the memorandum book and on a loose sheet, and then she sat down on the altar step with the sheet in her hand, and the Duke of Alderminster stood in the middle of his own chancel at 2 o'clock in the morning holding a lantern he had forgotten about. Say it again, he said. The 20th of February. You are certain. I am as certain as I am of my own name, and I will tell you exactly why, and you may take it apart if you can. The word is 8 letters. The spacing of the whole line runs 3/4 of an inch wider than the line above it, and the scribing runs out to the full measure at both ends, which means the man who set that line out set it out for a longer word than the word that is cut there now. There is a stop after the D of 20th, and a stop is not a scratch. There is the tail of a Y. There is a B with 2 bowls, and the lower bowl is bigger, and a man who cuts a B with 2 bowls the same size is not my father, and a man who cuts them different is. And the word February is in that wall, and the word March is on it, and they are not the same word, and the one underneath is older. The 20th of February, said the Duke. Yes, I have kept the 9th of March, he said, for 10 years. She had not thought of that, and it went through her like cold water. Every year on a day he had done whatever it was that he did. Gone into the vault or not gone in. Sat in this room, read something. Not eaten. Whatever a man does who has nobody to do it with, on the anniversary of the only person he had. He had been doing it 17 days late for 10 years, on the wrong day, on a day his father had already been in the ground on, because it was cut in stone in his own church, by a man who had cut it right, and been called a madman for saying so. He put the lantern down on the altar step very carefully, as though it might go off. Come with me, he said. The muniment room at Alderminster Court is on the north side of the house, and the door of it had not been unlocked since 1815. It smelled of paper and mice. He lit 2 candles off her lantern, and got a deed box down off a shelf with his good hand, and dragged it to the table with his knee, and the dust came off it in a slab. I have not opened this since the year they recut your father's stone, he said. That is not a coincidence I noticed until this minute. There were 4 instruments in the box, and he laid them out in order and let her read them, which took her 20 minutes, because a conveyance of 1810 is written to be paid for by the yard. The first was dated the 26th day of February 1810, and it sold the quarries at Netherley, with all beds, works, ways and appurtenances, out of the settled estate, to Gervase Quennell of Alderminster, gentleman, and Nathaniel Kite of the same gentleman, for £3,200. The second was dated the same day, and conveyed the 65 acres known as the Poor's Ground at Combe Bottom, which had fed the poor of Ninebarrow with potatoes and firing since before anyone's grandmother, to the same 2 men for £400. The third was a mortgage, dated the 2nd day of March, 1810, charging the whole remaining estate with £40,000. The fourth was a deed of appointment of new trustees, dated the 2nd day of March, 1810. Every one of the 4 recited that it was made by the 5th Duke of Alderminster, of sound mind, by his own hand, and every one of them carried his signature, and a seal, and 2 witnesses, one of whom was a clerk in Harnworth, who had gone to Canada in 1812, and the other of whom was Gervase Quennell's own servant. And on the 3rd and the 4th, under his father's, in a clear, steady hand with the long tail on the cue that Thomasin had seen him make 11 times a night on the estate accounts, was the signature of Roland Quennell, Marquess of Ancaster, the son and heir consenting, the 2nd day of March, 1810. Now you know, said the Duke of Alderminster. You were ill. I was ill from the 4th of February to the middle of March. I have that from Mrs. Vosper and from nobody else, because there is nobody else. I do not remember 1 hour of it. I remember being cold in the passage outside my father's room, and I remember a bird in the chimney, and then I remember the first week of April, and the trees were out. He put 1 finger on his own name on the page. I have been looking at that for 10 years. It is my hand. The Q is my Q. And for 10 years I have understood that at some point in a fortnight I cannot account for, somebody put a pen in my hand and told me it was necessary, and I signed away the quarry that employed 40 men of this parish, and the ground the poor of it got their potatoes off, and put £40,000 on my father's estate. And I have never been able to say to one living soul that I did not do it, because I do not know that I did not do it. The candles were burning badly. Somewhere above them the house ticked. That is why you do not go among people, said Thomasin. That is why I do not go among people. They think it is my face. He almost smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him try it, and it was a bad job on both sides. My face is the least of it. I could have got used to being looked at. I have never been able to get used to not knowing what I have done. Thomasin stood up. Her legs were shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Your Grace, she said, look at the dates. I have looked at the dates for 10 years. Then look at them again with what is in that wall. She put her finger on the first deed. The 26th of February, the 2nd of March. Your father was already in the vault anteroom by then, with the ground frozen too hard to open, and there is a man in this village who dug that grave, and a woman in your kitchen who laid him out. Those 4 deeds are made by a man who could not hold a pen, because he had been 6 days gone, and your name is on 2 of them, and if a hand that was 6 days gone can sign a deed, so can a man who was blind and out of his senses in a back bedroom. She was speaking too fast and did not care. We are not trying to prove that you are innocent, sir. There is no proving that. We are going to prove what day your father died, and every one of those papers falls down on its own. Mr. Kite came to the church on the 16th of November with a folded paper and a chair. The paper was an order of the surrogate, made on the representation of the churchwardens, reciting that whereas the person charged with the repair of the monument had been seen to cast water upon it, and to work upon it by night with lights and ladders, she should henceforth do no work in the said church, except in the presence of a churchwarden, who should attend at reasonable hours. The chair was for the churchwarden. He put it against the chancel arch, in the light, where he could see her hands, and he sat in it from 9 until 4 with his hat on his knee, and he did that every day for a fortnight, and he was never once rude to her. He said good morning. At noon he took a piece of bread and an apple out of his pocket, and offered her the apple, every day. And she refused it, every day, and it never made the smallest difference to how he offered it the next morning. When Kester dropped a chisel, he picked it up and handed it back handle first. When the light failed at 3:30, he said, "You will spoil your eyes." And she said, "They are my eyes." And he said, "So they are," and went back to sitting. She learned in that fortnight what her father had been up against, and it was not wickedness. It was a good man. That was the whole trouble with Mr. Nathaniel Kite. He had given Ninebarrow its school, and he went into it on Fridays and heard the reading. He had buried 2 wives, and both of them well thought of. He put coal into 11 cottages every December and did not put his name to it, and everybody knew. And that is the cleverest kind of charity there is. When he said in the porch, so that it carried, that he bore Miss Stannard no ill will and only wished she would let herself be helped. 40 people heard a decent man being patient. And 40 people were right, because he was being patient, and he meant it. And he had also cut a date out of a wall. On the 22nd, the vestry met, and voted 11-2 that a new tablet of statuary marble be procured at Mr. Kite's charge and set in the frame before Christmas, the old panel to be taken down and disposed of. The rector voted with the 11. The 2 were Job Redaway, who was not on the vestry and had no vote, and voted anyway, and a farmer named Hurd, who disliked Kite over a hedge. That evening Kite walked up the hill for the first time in 10 years, as far as the terrace, and would not come in, and stood in the wind with his hat in his hand, and Thomasin was sent for. "I am going to make you an offer," he said, in front of his Grace, so that nobody can say afterwards it was made in a corner. "Miss Stannard, I will pay the £200 into court myself, and the recognizance is discharged, and his Grace is out of it. I will pay you £50. And I will have Prideaux cut your father a headstone in good stone, of your own design and your own words, and set it in this churchyard, and I will pay the fee to the rector for the ground, and I will attend it myself. All I ask is that the panel be finished as it stands, and certified, and that you go back to Harnworth." The wind came across the terrace. Somewhere down in the park the sheep that were not theirs were making a noise. Thomasin had wanted a stone for her father since the 6th of February 1819. She had drawn it out 11 times. She knew the letters and the depth of them, and where the mark went. "Say the rest of it," she said. "There is no rest of it." "There is. Say the part where I cut the 9th day of March into that panel in my own hand, and put my father's tools to it, and sign my name at the foot as the repairer, so that in 100 years the answer to anybody who says the date was altered is that Stannard's own daughter went over it and found nothing." She was surprised at how steady she sounded. "You are not buying my silence, Mr. Kite. Silence is no good to you. My father was silent for 2 years in a room with 4 other men, and it did not help you at all. You are buying my hand. You want the lie cut by the only person in England who could have proved it, and you want it certified by an archdeacon, and then it is finished forever. And it is finished by us." Kite looked at her for a while with an expression she could not read, and then he put his hat on. "You are very like him," he said. "He would not be helped either." He turned to go down the steps and then stopped, and half turned back, and this was the only moment in the whole autumn when she heard anything at all under the surface of the man. "Your Grace, it is not my business to advise you. But there is an old book in your house with your name in it, and if this parish is going to be set by the ears over a date, some attorney will get that book into a court and read your name out of it aloud, and there will be no putting it back. You were ill. Nobody blames a sick man. I would think very hard before I let a stonemason's daughter open a thing that has been kindly shut for 10 years. He got as far as the bottom step. "Mr. Kite," said the Duke of Alderminster, "Your Grace, on what day did my father die?" The wind went on. Kite stood on the gravel with his hat on and his gloves in his hand, and the light out of the 2 lit windows was on the side of his face, and Thomasin watched a man decide something. "On the 9th of March, said Mr. Kite, as it says on the wall. Good night to you both. A hollow in a wall is not evidence." She had known that from the first afternoon, and she had gone on anyway because there was nothing else to do, but She knew it, and it sat on her chest at 4 in the morning in the hayloft. What a court wants is a thing it can hold, and a person it can swear. She got the person out of Mrs. Vosper on the 25th of November in the still room over a bowl of onions by asking a question nobody had put to that woman in 10 years. Who laid out the old Duke? Mrs. Vosper's hands stopped. I did. On what night? There was a long pause, and in it Thomasin watched something come up in the woman's face that had been a very long way down. I have said this twice in my life, said Mrs. Vosper, and both times I was told I had got my nights confused, and after the second time I stopped saying it, and I have thought about it every February since. It was the night of the 20th. I know it was the 20th, because I was in his Grace's room from 11, with the young man, and his fever broke at about 2 in the morning and he went wet through, and I was calling for water when Mr. Gervas came up the back stairs and said his father was gone and would I come. So I went from one to the other along that passage with the same candle. I laid out the old Duke and put the linen on him and came back and changed the young one's bed at 4:30, and there was ice on the inside of the window. And then nothing. For 11 days. The ground was iron. Redaway could not get down, and the house was shut up for the sickness, and nobody came in or out, and his Grace lay in the anteroom of the vault under a sheet from the 21st of February until the 12th of March, which is 3 weeks, and I went down every morning and looked at him, because it did not seem right that nobody should. And then in the March, the paper said he died on the 9th. And Mr. Kite, that was the steward, then came and sat where you are sitting, and told me the doctor had given the 9th and it was the doctor's business, and asked me very kindly whether I was quite sure I had not muddled the nights, being tired, and I said perhaps I had. Were you tired? I had had 4 hours sleep in 6 days, said Mrs. Vosper, so yes, and I have been quite sure for 10 years. Then she got up and went to the corner cupboard and came back with a screw of paper, and inside the paper was a mourning ring, plain gold, black enamel, a plait of grey hair under a crystal, the sort of thing a good servant orders when nobody else has thought to. I cut a lock off him that night because I did not think anybody would. I had it made up at Harnworth in the April, with my own money, 11 shillings, and I have never worn it because it is above my station, and I have never shown it to a living creature. Thomasin turned it to the window and read what was engraved round the inside of the band, in a jeweller's script, in the April of 1810, 4 weeks before any of it could have mattered to anybody. A.Q. died the 20th day of February 1810. The thing she could hold came 3 days later, and it came because she was tired and sat down in the wrong place. She had gone into the vestry to get out of the wind and sat on the floor with her back against the wall to eat a piece of bread, and found herself looking, from that unusual height, at the step in the vestry doorway. It was a slab of netherly white bed, 3 feet 6 by 18 inches, worn into a dish in the middle by 9 years of boots. She had watched it go in. She could remember the day, because it was the day the monument was bedded and there had been a piece of good stone left over, and the old rector had said it was a shame to waste it, and her father had said that a doorstep was a doorstep, and had had it carried across, and turned over and set down in the mud. Turned over. She got lug and kester, and 2 crowbars, and the churchwarden's permission, which took a day and a half and had to go through the rector, and on the 29th of November at 11 in the morning, with Mr. Kite standing in the doorway watching with his hat in his hands, they levered the vestry step up out of its bed and turned it over onto sacks. The underside was clean, because 9 years of Ninebarrow mud is a good preservative, and it was covered in letters. It was a trial, the whole of the middle of the inscription, cut through twice in places, some of it in half-inch letters, and some in the full inch and a quarter, the way a man works out his spacing before he touches the real stone. Who departed this life at Alderminster on the 20th day of February, in the year of our Lord 1810, and below it, in the corner small, the mason's mark her father cut on everything he ever finished, and the 2 letters SS, and the year 1811. And in the middle of the 3rd line there was 1 M that was wrong. It was too wide, and its middle came down too far, and it had been cut over the top of a lighter M that somebody had scribed properly, by a hand that had not yet learned to keep the mallet quiet. "That is mine," said Thomasin, kneeling on the sacks with her fingers on it, in front of the rector and the churchwarden and her own labourer. "He set it out for me, and I cut it badly, and he made me do the next one 4 times. I was 17. She cut the 3 indents in the first 12 days of December, and every hour of it was a fight. The block was 2 months out of the ground by then, and the sap was gone out of it. On the 10th of October she could have put her thumbnail into that stone. On the 4th of December she broke the point off a half-inch chisel on it before breakfast, and reground it, and broke it again at noon. Green stone gives you a cut with an edge on it like a folded page. Dry stone gives you a cut with a whisker of dust hanging in it, and you go back over every letter twice, and your wrist swells, and the 12th of December found her cutting the last line by candle at 4 in the afternoon, with her left hand wrapped in a rag because a chisel had jumped. She let the 3 pieces into the panel with a lime and stone dust, mortar the thickness of a shilling, and she cut them proud by a hair, and worked them back flush with a rubber and clean water, and on the 13th she stood back in the aisle and looked at what she had done. 3 strips of new Netherly white bed, let into a wall of the same stone, carrying the same words in the same letters that had been cut there in 1811 by her father, in the same hand as far as any hand can be the same. And they were white, not a shade off, white the way a tooth is white next to old ivory, because the stone around them had stood in a church for 9 years, and hers had come out of a hillside in October, and no mason living could have made them match, and it would be 20 years before the weather brought them anywhere near. "They will say you have made a botch of it," said Kester. "They will," said Thomasin. On the 15th of December, at 8:30 in the morning, 6 men came up the churchyard path with poles and a handcart and a bag of wedges, sent by the churchwardens, with a paper, to take the Alderminster monument down and remove it to a place of safety before the visitation. The Duke of Alderminster was standing in the chancel door. He had walked down the hill at 7, and he had not told anybody he was coming. And he stood in the doorway, in the grey, with his hat off and his whole face in the open light for the first time in 10 years, and 30 people came into that churchyard in a quarter of an hour to see it, and stayed. "That monument is my family's," he said. "The freehold of the chancel is mine, and the repair of it is mine, and the paper you are holding is signed by 2 churchwardens, one of whom bought my father's quarry from a man who had been 6 days in his coffin." You will not put a pole to it. Any man who wants to may go over me, and he had better be quick, because there are more people in this yard every minute, and I intend to say all of this again." Nobody went over him. The men stood about for 20 minutes, and then went away down the path, and one of them, at the gate, took his hat off. The frost came in that night. She had been waiting for it and dreading it since the mortar went in, because new mortar and new cut green quarried stone will not take a hard frost. The water in them freezes and swells and pops the face off in flakes, and there is nothing to be done afterwards but cut it all out and begin again. And there was no beginning again, because there was no time and no stone, and the visitation was on the 18th. So she slept in the church for 5 nights, from the 13th to the 17th, on straw under the tower, and kept a brazier burning on the plank under her 3 new strips all night, and fed it every 2 hours, and hung sacking down over the whole monument from the cornice, and got up at midnight, and at 2 and at 4 to bank it. Mrs. Vosper sent down a pair of blankets and a stone bottle. Kester came and did the 2 o'clock on the 15th without being asked, and would not take anything for it. At 6 on the morning of the 16th of December, she came out of the church into the churchyard, and the whole world had turned white and hard and utterly still, and the sky from one edge to the other was the color of a knife, and there was not a cloud on it anywhere. She stood in the path in her blanket, and began very quietly to laugh. Because you cannot have a hard frost under cloud. A hard frost is what the sky does when there is nothing over it at all, and a clear sky in the middle of December means the sun comes over the tower at a hand's breadth above the horizon, and goes in at the south window of that chancel, and lies along the north wall like a knife laid flat. The thing that could ruin her work was the only thing on earth that could prove her case. And there was more. When she took the sacking down at 8, she found that in the 12th line, the one line of the 1815 cutting that her father had not lived to open, 3 of the stopped letters had lifted. The frost had got into the wax through the hairline round each plug and swelled behind it and pushed, and there they stood, 3 little pale grains of wax, standing proud of the face of the stone, out of the middle of the words in the 62nd year of his age, where no letter had any business being at all. Her father had gone to gaol for taking that wax out with a chisel. The frost did it in one night for nothing. Dr. Follett, archdeacon, held his adjourned visitation in the church of St. Cuthbert, Ninebarrow, on Monday the 18th day of December, 1820, and it was the largest congregation that building had held since the peace. He was a dry, thin, precise old man who disliked enthusiasm in all its forms and had ridden 11 miles in a frost. He viewed the monument from the floor with his hands behind his back, said that the workmanship of the repair appeared to him to be good, and the color of the new stone to be regrettable, and was about to certify it and go home when Thomasin Stannard asked leave to be heard. Mr. Kite said, with great gentleness, that he hoped the court would not be detained by an unhappy young woman's private grief. Grief is not evidence, Miss Stannard, he said. I have said so to you kindly, and I say it now. No, sir, said Thomasin. It is not. That is why I have not brought you any. She turned to the archdeacon. I ask for a quarter of an hour. I do not ask you to believe me, and I have nothing to read out. I want 15 minutes, and the sun, and I want everybody in this church to look at that wall with their own eyes. Dr. Follett took out his watch and looked at it. "It is 9 minutes past 2, he said. "You may have until 2:30. For 5 minutes nothing happened at all, and it was the longest 5 minutes of her life. The chancel was full and cold and quiet. The tower throws its shadow across the south window until about 2:15 in December, and she stood under the monument with her hands at her sides and watched the top edge of that shadow come down the inside of the far wall, the way you watch water come out of a lock, an inch and an inch and an inch. At 14 minutes past 2 it went off the glass. The sun came through the south window of St. Cuthbert's at a hand's breadth above the horizon and lay along the north wall almost flat, and the whole of that wall changed. Every worn place in it stood up, and in the middle of it, out of the smooth face of the Alderminster panel, in the 3 long strips where a man had ground an inscription away in 1815 and stopped what was left with wax, there rose a second inscription in shadow, faint and grey and perfectly legible. Standing a little to the left of the words that were carved there in the light, somebody in the 3rd pew said, "Oh, on the 20th day of February," said Thomasin Stannard, and she did not need to point, and she did not raise her voice, because there was no need for either. "It is under the 9th day of March. It has been under it since 1815. The stone says both, and it always did, and my father did not deface this monument, he uncovered it, and he did it at night with a lantern, because a lantern is the only sun there is in November, and that is the whole of what he was doing in this chancel when they took him by the arm. The light held for 19 minutes, and she used all of them. They carried in the vestry step on 2 poles and turned it face up in the chancel, and let the archdeacon read the trial cutting on it, with his own eyes, and the mark, and the 2 letters, and the year 1811. Mrs. Vosper stood up in the back pew, and said what she had said in the still room, and gave the ring into Dr. Follett's hand, and it went along the front pews from hand to hand, and nobody spoke while it went. Job Redaway said that he had not been able to open the ground for 11 days that February for the frost, and that when the frost broke he had been told to wait, and had waited another 10 days and never been given a reason, and that a man remembers the year he could not dig. Micah Lugg said that the blue bed at Netherley was first opened in the summer of 1813, that he had helped to open it, and that there was no blue stone above ground anywhere in the county before that year. And Thomasin got up on the plank with a penknife and lifted out of the 12th line, in front of 40 people, 3 grains of wax that the frost had pushed out of the wall in the night, and held them up and passed them down. Mr. Kite sat through all of it, in his own pew, with his hat on his knee, and when it was finished, he stood up and said, "I bought that quarry in good faith, and I shall answer for it in a proper place and not in a church," and put his hat on his head inside the building, which nobody in Ninebarrow had ever seen him do, and walked out down the middle aisle, and the whole congregation turned to watch him go, and not one person got up to follow him. Then the Duke of Alderminster stood up in the chancel, and turned round, and let his parish look at him. "I cannot tell you that I did not sign those deeds," he said. "That is the thing I came here to say, and I would rather have said anything else. I was out of my senses in that house, from February to the middle of March in 1810, and I do not remember 1 hour of it, and there is a book with my name in it, and I have been frightened of it for 10 years, and being frightened of it is the reason I have not stood in this church while 3 of you were buried. I am not asking you to say I did not do it. I am telling you what I do not know, out loud, in front of all of you. And I find I should have done it in 1811. Dr. Follett certified the repair as well and truly done, refused to allow the new tablet, ordered that the panel be not touched, took the trial slab, the ring, and a copy of Thomasin's figures into his own custody, and sent the whole matter to the bishop's chancellor and to the magistrates on the same afternoon. The rest of it took 2 years, as those things do. The deeds of February and March 1810 were set aside in Chancery in the Michaelmas term of 1822, on the finding that the 5th Duke was already deceased when they were executed. The £40,000 went with them. The Netherley quarries came back to the estate in the spring of 1823, and the 65 acres of the poor's ground came back to the poor of Ninebarrow, who had their potatoes off it that same year. Mr. Kite went to live at Bath and died there, and left the school an endowment, and the school kept it, because a school has to eat. Simeon Stannard's conviction was not undone. There is no machinery for undoing a conviction against a man who is not alive to be pardoned, and the clerk of the peace at Harnworth wrote a very civil letter explaining it, so the parish did the other thing instead. In the autumn of 1821, the vestry gave the ground free, and his daughter cut him a stone out of the waste of the Hanger Copse block, with his name and his trade and his dates on it, and his mason's mark at the foot, and set it herself, on the south side, 11 feet from the chancel wall, on the inside of which he had cut the truth twice. They asked her, at the vestry, whether she would not bring in the 3 new strips with a stain, so that they would not show so white. No, said Thomasin. It is a mended thing. Let it look mended. She went back to Harnworth in the January and stayed 9 months, because the bond was discharged and she was free to go, and a woman who has been bound to a thing wants to find out what she does when she is not. He wrote to her every Wednesday, 4 or 5 lines, mostly about the estate and once about a heron. She came back in the October for the setting of her father's stone, and he asked her in the churchyard with his hat in his hands, badly, and she said yes before he had properly finished. They were married at St. Cuthbert's in the spring of 1822, in front of most of the parish, and Mrs. Vosper cried and denied it. And on the 20th of February in the year 1823, at 2:09 in the afternoon, the Duke and Duchess of Alderminster were standing together in the chancel of their own church, alone in the cold, waiting the tower shadow came off the glass at 14:14. The light went along the north wall, and out of the face of that panel the older letters rose up in shadow beside the new ones, the way they would go on doing for a few weeks every winter for 400 years. And her husband put his hand on the wall under the 3 white strips his wife had cut, and read the day of his father's death aloud, on the right day, for the first time in his life.